The cameras catch the moment mid-sentence. Representative Jasmine Crockett leaning forward, voice sharp, the kind of tone that slices through polite conversation and leaves bare nerve. Under the searing white of the studio lights, her words collide with the air like sparks off steel. Maybe the robes made her forget what real people look like, she snaps, laughter half buried in her breath. The crowd inhales as one. The moderator freezes, his practiced smile crystallized in panic. Every lens zooms closer, hunting the next word. Somewhere in the control room, a producer mouths, "Did she really just say that?" Judge Ruth doesn't flinch. She sits there, framed in calm, spine straight as a courthouse column, hands folded lightly. The years show not in frailty but in gravity. Her stillness becomes a spotlight of its own, exposing every ounce of bluster opposite her. Crockett continues, too far to retreat now, her syllables ricocheting around the panel table. Each phrase drips with a daring contempt that only amplifies the tension. The air begins to thicken, voices from the audience stammer in disbelief. A young woman in the second row covers her mouth, eyes wide, as if witnessing history stumble in real time. The microphones hum. Judge Ruth exhales once, just enough to remind everyone she is still there. Then her gaze rises, measured, unblinking. The movement is slow, deliberate, the sort that makes even the restless lean forward. No rebuttal yet, only silence, and somehow that silence is louder than any word could be. Crockett falters. The rhythm of her own indignation betrays her, her sentence tailing off into the sudden hush that swallowed the room. Cameras hold their breath. In that pause, every viewer feels gravity reassert itself, authority grounded not in dominance, but in unshakable composure. For a heartbeat, nothing exists but the hum of circuitry and the quiet power of stillness. Even the lights seem to dim, as if recognizing that something far heavier than politics has entered the room. Then, a faint click as the studio clock ticks over another second. The standoff hangs suspended, electric, unbreakable. But what happened next would turn that silence into the moment America couldn't stop replaying. Minutes before the tension erupted, the studio had pulsed with the familiar rhythm of polite debate. The topic was judicial oversight, an issue dry enough on paper to lull even the caffeinated reporter. Yet beneath the fluorescent calm simmered something volatile. The panel wasn't just a meeting of minds, it was a collision of eras. Representative Jasmine Crockett sat forward, posture alive with purpose. Her charisma radiated through the lens, the viral darling of progressive soundbites, a champion for those who'd grown weary of old systems moving at glacial speed. Across from her, Judge Ruth embodied that very steadiness, seasoned, deliberate, an anchor of principle in a political tide that seemed to reward outrage. At first, Crockett played it measured, her tone studiously respectful. But the current was visible, a spark flickering beneath her control. She framed her arguments with rhythm and confidence, weaving passion into policy, carefully constructing a scene that showcased her as the disruptor who dared to speak truth to antiquity. Then came the pivot. "With all due respect," she said, voice dipped in sugar, "we can't keep pretending that yesterday's perspectives hold a roadmap for tomorrow's justice." The words were wrapped in reason, yet the sting was unmistakable. On social media, the moment would later be clipped, slowed down, dissected in 10-second chunks. But in the studio, the impact was immediate. The moderator's eyebrows twitched. The audience leaned forward, reading between the lines. Judge Ruth gave a brief nod, almost imperceptible, as if acknowledging the barb without granting it life. That single gesture irritated, because restraint, when weaponized, can look like authority refusing to yield. Crockett pressed further, voice sharpening with conviction. "There's a difference between wisdom," she declared, "and being so far removed from the struggles the rest of us live that wisdom turns into nostalgia." The phrase hung there, elegant, provocative, and rude all at once. The audience murmured, a low thunder threatening to break. A young intern sitting behind the cameras whispered, "Oh no, she didn't." For viewers at home, it wasn't merely entertainment, it was validation of a familiar frustration. They saw in Jasmine the righteous impatience of a generation taught to fight for its own voice. Yet even as that resonance grew, so did the tension. Progressiveness without respect starts to echo the very arrogance it claims to resist. Judge Ruth remained silent, gaze steady. Her quiet suggested not fragility but choice, the seasoned understanding that some storms reveal their substance only when met with stillness. The room's energy split down in visible lines. Some were enthralled, nodding at the audacity of speaking truth to power. Others recoiled, uneasy that a challenge meant to unearth justice had turned personal. What began as ideology now smelled faintly of spectacle. Crockett smiled, a flicker of triumph. Every debate is theater, she knew, and in theater timing is everything. The audience's cameras weren't her threat, they were her allies. But in chasing applause, she hadn't yet noticed how fast admiration can harden into discomfort. Somewhere beyond the bright stage lights, a producer muttered instructions through the headsets. Stay wide, something's building. In that suspended second before the shift, both women embodied their archetypes completely. Crockett, radiant with rebellious fire, Ruth, reflective calm forged from decades of public scrutiny. Two worlds stared across a narrow table, and in that stare, something ancient resurfaced, the eternal American question of whether passion or poise defines true strength. But for every accusation she hurled, she never expected Ruth to stand there, embodying a kind of quiet power that would soon flip the narrative. Before the studio lights ever found her, Jasmine Crockett had already made a name for herself in digital firestorms. Her story began not in marble halls or inherited power, but in a crowded apartment lined with political posters and unrelenting ambition. She'd been the first in her family to pass the bar, the one who refused to sit quietly in a system that too often mispronounced her name. For years she ran on fuel that mixed pride with exhaustion, each victory, a declaration that she belonged. What separated Jasmine from countless other local reformers was speed. She mastered the algorithm instinctively. One crisp takedown clip, 10 seconds long, could ignite a week of trending headlines. Each clip was theater choreographed for conviction. Arms slicing air, voice raised just enough to ride the surge of online applause. The people she spoke for saw courage in her defiance. And indeed, there was courage, real, raw, unstoppable. But entwined with it was something harder to define, a growing dependency on spectacle itself. Every ping of a notification became affirmation, every camera a confessional booth where politics turned to performance. She told herself that it was service, the only way to be heard in a world numbed by noise. Yet as her audience grew, so did her caution. Authenticity began to harden into habit, words rehearsed to sound unrehearsed. Between interviews she'd glance at her phone not to check calls from colleagues, but metrics, likes, loops, shares. Visibility wasn't the byproduct, it was the prize. She didn't start as arrogant. She started tired of being unseen. But the problem with being perpetually watched is that you stop being able to look inward. Off camera, alone in hotel rooms after rallies, she'd scroll through her mentions until dawn. The praise was exhilarating, but the criticism, that was venom she stored in private jars. She'd replay insults in her head like sparring partners, promising herself that next time she'd strike before they even raised their guard. Thus the public tone sharpened, clever rebuttals replacing conversation, witticism rising where empathy once sat. Each argument wasn't merely a policy defense, it was a duel staged for engagement. Her base expected fireworks now, and Jasmine obliged. The idea of restraint began to sound suspiciously like surrender. When the network invited her to debate Judge Ruth, she saw opportunity wrapped in risk. The judge carried decades of credibility, the kind that couldn't be edited into viral gold. Taking her on would either elevate Jasmine to mainstream legitimacy or brand her permanently as the hothead who mistook audacity for achievement. But ambition has its own gravity, she accepted before doubt had the chance to whisper. The night before filming, she rehearsed in front of a mirror, refining her angles. She reminded herself she was the voice of a new generation, brazen, unafraid, allergic to deference. What she didn't realize was that the very polish she added sanded away sincerity. The mirror reflected a warrior, but not the wound that had made her fight in the first place. By the time the cameras rolled, every spotlight found her perfectly. Too perfectly. The lighting kissed her face into porcelain brightness, the glow of triumph had no shadows to temper it. The audience saw the gleam but missed the cost. How pride can masquerade as confidence when really it's armor welded to fear. In that overexposed light, Jasmine's every word shimmered with brilliance that left no room for vulnerability. Backstage producers whispered about her poise, her stagecraft. Commentators admired her presence. Yet even as the praise stacked higher, her pulse quickened. Every compliment became a countdown. If she didn't outshine herself tonight, the internet would move on without her tomorrow. So when debate turned personal, when respect gave way to confrontation under the heat of those studio beams, she leaned harder into the only rhythm she knew, outrun discomfort with dominance. If the older woman across from her remained still, Jasmine read that stillness as weakness. If the crowd gasped, she mistook that reaction for victory. Her instinct told her to punch harder, unaware that she was shadowboxing with her own reflection. The spark that had launched her career, the refusal to be silenced, was still noble in essence. But somewhere along the ascent, the spark became spotlight, and spotlight became addiction. The louder she spoke, the more invisible her uncertainty became. In the control room, an assistant watching the live feed whispered, "She's winning." A seasoned producer replied without looking up, "Then why does it feel like she's losing something?" Because pride shines bright, but light without shade blinds more than it guides. Jasmine Crockett was electric, intoxicating, necessary, but every revolution risks becoming performance art if the crowd's cheer replaces self-awareness. And on that stage, beneath lights meant to illuminate truth, she stood brilliant yet burning. But if ambition was her armor, Ruth's calm was the blade that would pierce right through it. Before the headlines and viral clips, before the debates that made her name synonymous with integrity, there was simply Ruth. A young law clerk in sensible shoes, holding a stack of case files taller than her paycheck, walking into courthouses where her voice was the softest, and therefore, in her mind, the one that needed to echo the longest. Her beginnings were not glamorous. She grew up in a small town that prized manners more than ambition, where women were expected to temper intellect with charm. Yet Ruth's form of charm came in the shape of fierce courtesy, a politeness so deliberate it disarmed. Professors mistook it for hesitance. Classmates thought it odd that she listened more than she spoke. But that habit became her art. She discovered that silence, properly used, could rearrange a room. When she graduated, the legal world wasn't waiting with open arms. She sent out resumes that returned like boomerangs stamped "regret to inform." Some judges refused to hire her simply because they had never had a woman in chambers. She didn't complain publicly, instead, she outprepared them all. In every rejection letter, she saw a future footnote, a reminder that progress requires persistence, not permission. Her breakthrough came in a courtroom where decorum met defiance. A defense attorney twice her age leaned in mid-trial and whispered, "You're too calm for this job." Ruth smiled, adjusted her papers, and proceeded to win the case on precedent he dismissed as trivial. Later, when reporters asked how she managed to stay unshaken, she replied, "Because shouting never changed a verdict." Years layered upon years, each one sanding her into something steady. Through the civil rights battles of the 70s, the gender wars of the 80s, and the ideological fractures of the new millennium, Ruth became a figure made not by outrage but by endurance. Her rulings were written with the grace of someone who believed justice wasn't a contest of decibels but of depth. There were moments of loneliness. Colleagues courted limelight, hosting press conferences while she chose late nights reading case histories. Her name rarely trended, but her reasoning quietly threaded itself through landmark decisions that widened freedoms by inches. Small gains, steady hands. And in those inches lay the measure of a lifetime. Then came the backlash that tests every principled life, the headlines calling her outdated, commentators branding judicial temperament as detachment. Younger pundits misread her restraint as apathy. Yet she understood that calm was not disengagement, it was discipline, wrestled from years confronting injustice without losing sight of humanity. There's a story her clerks love to tell. One morning, after a particularly vicious editorial, Ruth arrived early to chambers carrying 2 coffees. She placed one on a clerk's desk and said, "They misunderstand because they are in a hurry. Our job is never to hurry." That was her credo, not a slogan for interviews, but a lived ethic worn into the rhythm of every decision she signed. Beneath the surface of her serenity was steel. The quiet voice, the measured tone, these weren't artifacts of age but tools honed through impact. She had seen courts where fury consumed compassion, where noise drowned nuance. She refused to let that be her legacy. Her office walls told her story better than any biography could. One pencil-sketched portrait from a protester thanking her for a ruling that protected immigrant families. A framed newspaper clipping dated years before social media existed, headline fading but the words still clear. Judge balances scales, defends the unheard. Each piece was less an accolade than a breadcrumb marking a trail back to purpose.
And still, she doubted.
When the culture shifted toward immediacy, when virality replaced victory, Ruth sometimes wondered if integrity could survive this new velocity. Yet every time cynicism threatened, she'd return to her rituals. Tea at dusk, rereading favorite passages of constitutional arguments, handwritten notes to young lawyers urging them to outlisten rather than outshout. In the stillness of those moments, she found her rebellion. What audiences would later see as presence wasn't born on camera. It was forged in courtrooms too cold in winter and politics too hot in summer. Every delay, every condescension, every headline calling her irrelevant, pressed her deeper into the truth that steadfastness itself is an act of resistance. So when the invitation arrived to join the televised debate, she hesitated. Part of her dreaded the spectacle, the editing, the inevitable distortion of nuance. Yet another part understood the duty, that civility must not retreat simply because aggression made better television. She would go, not to defend herself, but to model something bigger. The art of standing unbroken in a culture addicted to breaking points. The morning of the event, she pinned her judicial brooch as she always did, tiny scales of justice resting near her heart. A quiet ritual, nothing symbolic in her mind, but to those who later studied the footage, it gleamed beneath the lights like armor. She looked in the mirror once, not to admire, but to remind herself, "You've weathered worse than words." As the car carried her to the studio, she looked out at the city, busy, brash, unfiltered. Billboards blinked with slogans promising urgency. Ads shouted, "Don't wait." Ruth chuckled softly. She'd spent a lifetime waiting, not passively but purposefully, trusting that truth blooms slow. So when the confrontation finally arrived, when Jasmine Crockett's challenge sliced through the air, Ruth didn't need to fabricate grace. She simply reached for the composure she had built brick by brick, year by year, from a foundation of patience nobody paid to watch. And it was precisely that history, the decades of storms weathered, that made her next words detonate with such calm finality. The studio air had changed texture. You could almost see it, thick, shimmering with unspoken challenge. Jasmine Crockett leaned forward, electric confidence thrumming through every syllable. What began as reasoned argument had evolved into a rhythm of dominance. Declaration, jab, pause for effect, repeat. Her words hit with the cadence of a practiced symphony played just slightly too loud. "Respect is earned, not inherited," she declared, eyes locked on Ruth like a fighter measuring distance before the strike. "And the judiciary can't hide behind age or tradition anymore. Not when real lives hang in the balance." The sentence drew cheers from one corner of the audience, a crack of approval quickly swallowed by collective tension. Crockett heard the sound and mistook it for consent from the nation itself. She rode that adrenaline, voice soaring higher with each assertion. Judge Ruth remained motionless, hands still, expression untouched. Only her eyes moved, following the rhythm of Jasmine's gestures, studying, not reacting. Every camera took note. Producers knew this was the shot that sells a story, one woman aflame, the other made of stone. On the split screen, contrast turned into narrative. Crockett paced within her seat, words flaring brighter than their meaning. Ruth, framed in stoic half-light, seemed carved from the very idea of restraint. Commentators in the booth whispered into their mics, unsure whether they were witnessing brilliance or overreach. Jasmine struck again. America's tired of lectures about patience.
They want action.
They want change now, not another speech about decorum. Her voice ricocheted across the set, applause and discomfort tangled in the wake. Every tone shouted conviction, but beneath it ran that pulse of defensiveness, the instinct to prove, not to persuade. Ruth didn't rise to it, she let the words pass like waves against granite. A man in the front row shifted, uneasy. A college student near the aisle whispered to her friend, "Why isn't the judge saying anything?" That whisper captured the entire country's curiosity. Silence had become the story. Jasmine mistook that silence for surrender. "You see," she pressed, gesturing toward Ruth. "Quiet when it matters most." The camera cut close on Ruth's face. No flicker, no rebuttal, only the faint lift of an eyebrow, a signal too subtle for anyone but the lens to catch. Somewhere behind the scenes, a technical director muttered, "Stay on her. Something's coming." The debate shifted tempo. Crockett's next statement stumbled slightly, her sentence tangling midway. The crowd felt the rhythm break, a glitch in the performance. She recovered fast, yet the first shadow of doubt crossed her face, brief but visible. It was as though her words, once weightless, had grown suddenly heavy in her own mouth. For viewers at home, it created delicious tension. Who would break first, the fire or the formality? The screen seemed to vibrate between these two gravities, each pulling for control of the national heartbeat. Crockett leaned back now, warming her tone, trying to turn severity into swagger. "I respect experience," she said, smile flicking between sincerity and challenge, "but experience without empathy is just bureaucracy in a robe." The audience gasped. That was the line people would tweet before the commercial break.
Still, Ruth didn't bite.
Instead she turned her gaze toward the moderator as if to ask, almost politely, "Are we finished yet?" The gesture struck harder than a counterargument. It was the weight of someone deciding when this ends, not begging for the floor to speak. In the control booth, an anchor whispered into the livestream, "She's either about to be demolished, or we're about to witness a masterclass." Crockett's breath quickened. She sensed the stakes rearranging mid-air. Fame's spotlight is fickle, it glows until it glares. Her next words came faster, layered with defensiveness she masked as passion. "You can't hide behind platitudes forever. The people deserve answers, actual answers." Ruth's eyes lifted once more. No sigh, no smile, just the faint exhale of someone who'd been waiting, not retreating. That single breath shifted momentum. Every viewer felt it. The debate had tilted. The louder Jasmine grew, the smaller her space became. The quieter Ruth sat, the larger her presence swelled. It wasn't volume that commanded authority, it was command itself. For a long second, silence held, and inside it, possibility gathered like stormlight before the break. Then, Just when it seemed Crockett had seized the night, Ruth leaned forward and released 13 words that stopped time. Time seemed to pause between heartbeats. The hum of studio lights, once white noise, now carried a slow pulse that felt almost human. Judge Ruth straightened, not stiffly but with the subtle grace of someone rearranging the weight of the entire room onto her shoulders. Every pair of eyes shifted toward her, though she had yet to speak. Even Jasmine Crockett's glare softened into curiosity, the primal awareness that something irreversible was about to begin. When Ruth finally opened her mouth, her voice was low, deliberate, and resonant, like a stone skipping once across still water and vanishing only after reshaping the surface. "Representative," she began, "I have listened to you carefully. You've spoken of urgency, of impatience, of wanting justice to move faster." She paused, gaze unflinching. "I know that feeling. I once wore it myself like armor." Her tone was calm but carried undertones of steel, an authority not imposed but earned. "You speak of experience as if it belongs only to those too tired to change," Ruth continued. "But experience lives in the record of mistakes the young have yet to make. It is the ledger of lessons we've already paid for, so you don't have to repeat them." The audience barely breathed. Crockett, frozen mid-gesture, tried to interrupt but found no foothold. Ruth wasn't overpowering her, she was disarming her. Every sentence arrived wrapped in empathy, not accusation, and that was the deadliest precision of all. "When you accuse me of being out of touch," Ruth said, "you're right in part. I am out of touch with cynicism. I can't seem to reach the kind of politics that treats decency as weakness." A soft murmur rippled through the crowd, half shock, half admiration. The moderator's pen stopped moving. Cameras tightened in, hungry for that perfect still frame where revelation looks like revolution. Ruth went on slower now, letting each phrase breathe. "I have ruled for communities ignored by power, for immigrants who came here believing fairness wasn't a myth. I've defended workers who were told they asked for too much and women who were told they spoke too loudly. I've watched laws change faces but not souls. So forgive me if I don't confuse volume for vision." Another beat, quiet as snowfall on glass. You could almost hear the collective realization that her words were no longer confined to this debate, they had drifted out the studio doors towards something larger. In homes across the country, viewers leaned forward instinctively, sensing truth stretching its legs. Crockett blinked hard, trying to corral the debate back toward policy. "This isn't about you," she said quickly, the tremor barely hidden. Ruth smiled without mockery. "It's never about me. It's about how we speak to one another when the country is watching, and how we teach them to speak when it's not." The line hung mid-air like a slow-spinning coin. The silence afterward wasn't awkward, it was reverent. Then she leaned forward, eyes steady on Jasmine. "You say respect must be earned. So let me earn it the way I always have, with reason, not reaction." She motioned gently toward the audience. "Every person here carries a story carved from struggle. None of us has the right to dismiss another's scars simply because they healed in a different decade." Her words folded ideology into intimacy. They weren't crafted for applause, they reached instead for conscience. She spoke now as though offering counsel to the entire room. "Progress doesn't mean erasing the past, it means learning how to carry it without letting it crush us. We don't burn down institutions to feel powerful. We rebuild them so no one else is left outside their doors." Across the set, a cameraman swallowed hard, forgetting his cue to pan. A cynic could have called it performance, but the tremor in Ruth's voice betrayed something purer. The ache of someone who had spent a lifetime in restraint and chosen, finally, to make that restraint itself her argument. "You want justice that moves faster," she said quietly. "So do I. But haste has a habit of confusing righteousness with revenge. And that never feeds the hungry or shelters the poor. It only gives anger somewhere to live." The silence deepened again, this time weighted with respect. Crockett's bravado faltered, the energy that had once filled the room now circled Ruth instead, orbiting her calm gravity. For 12 seconds, no one dared speak, move, or even exhale with noise. Then Ruth finished what would become one of the most replayed moments in modern debate history. Her voice softened to a near whisper, but the microphones carried it clear. "Real strength," she said, "is deciding you'd rather heal a wound than win a fight."
13 words.
They landed, and time broke open. A collective inhale rippled through the live audience. The moderator's lips parted, then closed again. In homes and phones nationwide, viewers froze mid-scroll. For a heartbeat, even the chatter of social media seemed to hesitate before bursting into awe. The studio remained still long enough for everyone to feel the shift. This wasn't triumph, it was transformation, the subversion of spectacle. Where the world expected fury, it received grace. Jasmine Crockett blinked, searching for a retort that no longer fit the mood. She looked across at Ruth and saw, for the first time that night, not an adversary but a mirror reflecting a version of herself she had forgotten. Ambitious, yes, but also yearning for dignity. Her lips tightened in acknowledgement, a gesture small enough to miss but large enough to matter. Somewhere in the back row, a young law student whispered, "That's how power should sound." It wasn't said like a fan's cheer, but like a prayer. Ruth sat back, hands still folded, composure intact. If she felt victory, she hid it. If she felt vindication, she wielded it only as restraint. Her point had never been to defeat Jasmine. Her point was to remind everyone watching that words, when used without cruelty, can still change the temperature of the world. The moderator finally spoke, voice cracking, "Judge Ruth, thank you." No one applauded, they simply couldn't yet. Applause felt crude in the presence of something quieter, but far more permanent. Ruth glanced toward Jasmine. "We all want a better country," she said softly. "I only ask that, in chasing it, we don't lose the kindness that built it." The crowd found breath again, murmuring in refrains of astonishment. Phones lifted, recording what they all subconsciously knew would fill feeds within minutes. Backstage, a producer whispered, "We just witnessed the line that'll define the decade."
And he wasn't wrong.
Because that night, amid the shouting world, one calm voice had reclaimed the microphone. But Ruth's words didn't end there, they detonated far beyond that studio. By midnight, the clip had already escaped the studio and found its way into every corner of the digital bloodstream. On Night Owl timelines and text threads alike, the 13 words glow-edged their way across glowing screens. The phrase "heal a wound rather than win a fight" appeared beside candle emojis, heart icons, and tags that multiplied faster than algorithms could follow. Hashtag Ruth said it first, trending. Hashtag Grace goes viral, climbing. And then the simplest, most powerful one, hashtag the silence. Within hours, the viral ecosystem had done what it always does, spinning meaning, remixing moments, remixing the remix. But this time, the noise carried respect instead of ridicule. Memes appeared before dawn, split images of Ruth and Jasmine under captions like "volume is not equal to value," or "the loudest voice isn't always the strongest spine." Late-night hosts replayed the sequence in slow motion, letting that frozen silence stretch like a sermon. News anchors analyzed her pitch and pause as though decoding prophecy. For the first time in months, the 24-hour cycle had found something that wasn't scandal or spectacle, but still every bit as gripping: equilibrium itself. Commentators who rarely agreed on dates of the week nodded in rare unison. One conservative panelist admitted, almost reluctantly, "That's how you argue without losing your humanity." A progressive columnist posted, "I think I just saw feminism meet civility on live TV." Meanwhile, in living rooms far from Washington, everyday citizens became participants in a national breathing exercise. Parents rewound the clip for their children, explaining, "See that moment? That's what respect looks like when it refuses to run." College students interrupted cafeteria chatter to imitate her poise, holding mock debates in which whoever spoke first lost. Teachers introduced her reply into classrooms as an example of rhetoric meeting empathy. The moment had metamorphosed into movement. At 2 a.m., one immigrant father in Detroit typed beneath the trending hashtag, "When she said it's about how we speak to each other, I felt seen. My kids ask me why I stay calm when people yell. Now I can show them." The comment crossed 1 million likes before sunrise. Every platform found its poet. Short videos layered violins under her words. Animators turned the courtroom scale brooch on Ruth's collar into a fluttering emblem of balance. The world had created its own sequel without her lifting a finger. Jasmine Crockett, awake in her apartment and staring at her phone's relentless notifications, scrolled through the headlines with a complicated cocktail of admiration and regret. She had chased virality for years and finally achieved it, only by standing next to someone who never tried. Still, amid the sting, she reposted Ruth's line to her story with 3 words beneath it, lesson absorbed respectfully.
It wasn't defeat.
It was growth, visible in pixels. Morning talk shows filled their backdrops with the now iconic still image, Ruth mid-sentence, hand lowered, face composed, a nation listening. The freeze that silenced the room, one program called it. But viewers knew better. It hadn't silenced, it had tuned. Writers published essays overnight, describing the phenomenon as a hunger for quiet power. A sociologist explained it using graphs. When conversations grow too harsh, populations instinctively gravitate towards symbols of composure. But most people didn't need academia to tell them, they could feel the relief blooming behind their ribs. Clips of ordinary people mimicking Ruth's pause flooded feeds. A construction worker recording from his lunch truck, "I used to think being calm meant giving up. Guess I was wrong." A teenage girl whispering before school, Real strength is deciding you'd rather heal a wound than win a fight, words mouthed like a mantra. Trending songs sampled her cadence. Someone in Los Angeles tattooed the phrase onto their forearm by mid-afternoon. By the time international outlets picked up the story, the moment had crossed language barriers. In Seoul, a news anchor translated her sentence with reverence. In Nairobi, radio callers debated what leadership with empathy could look like in their own systems. London papers dubbed her the woman who spoke in silence. What had started as a 3-minute exchange became a kind of communal exhale, proof that the storm of discourse had not yet drowned grace. It wasn't about left or right anymore. It was about relief, that somewhere amid the shouting, a whisper had survived. Back in the States, camera crews parked outside Ruth's modest townhouse, waiting for her first comment. Inside, she had turned off her television hours earlier. She brewed tea, stacked her notes from the debate, and sent an email to her staff. We work as we always have.
No victory posts. The work speaks.
But outside, the world had turned her restraint into revelation. Influencers posted compilations of public figures losing tempers spliced beside Ruth's stillness. Headlines declared, "Dignity goes viral." Editorials warred over interpretation, yet all conceded a single truth. She reminded a cynical generation what grace looks like when it stops apologizing. That night, the clip played again across evening networks, this time underscored by swelling orchestral music. The camera zoomed slowly on Ruth's final line and fade to black cue that seemed almost divine in timing. And buried inside those millions of views was one final message Ruth herself would deliver the next morning. Morning crept across the capital with the color of forgiveness, those gentle blues that only appear after a storm has spent itself. On courthouse steps still slick from dawn rain, reporters gathered, lenses glinting like restless eyes. The world wanted the sequel to that silence, the coda to the calm that had captured a country. Judge Ruth emerged precisely at 8. Not flanked by staff, not enveloped in security theatrics, just her, a scarf against the breeze and a folder tucked neatly under one arm. The murmurs stilled as she approached the microphones. She did not clear her throat or glance at notes, she simply began as though continuing a conversation left paused the night before. Disagreements, she said, voice steady but soft enough to make the crowd lean in, are not proof that our nation is broken. They're the proof that it's alive. A flicker of smiles rippled across faces. We argue because we care what kind of country we become. But caring loudly is not the same as caring wisely. Cameras clicked, but she didn't pose. She continued, lifting her gaze just high enough that it seemed to rest on everyone and no one. I've listened to my critics, she admitted. They remind me that patience can look like privilege, and passion can sound like disrespect. Maybe they're both right. Maybe we all need to learn the volume of our convictions. The sentence hung, almost musical. Even the wind seemed to pause for punctuation. I'm grateful for voices like Representative Crockett's, Ruth went on. We need her fire as much as we need composure. But fire on its own can burn the house we're trying to renovate. So we bring water, not to extinguish truth, but to shape it. A reporter whispered, barely audible, she's teaching.
And in a sense she was.
The tone had become less press conference and more homily, a civics lesson delivered under an open sky. Ruth rested her hand on the podium. We keep forgetting that democracy is built not on uniformity, but on empathy, the active, uncomfortable practice of hearing someone out before responding. We will never always agree. But we can always choose to stay human while we disagree. Behind her, sunlight poured through the courthouse columns, casting long golden stripes that framed her in warm geometry. The image would travel across news feeds within minutes, the lone figure in morning light, poised between shadow and daybreak. She smiled faintly. Power in this country isn't what tilts the microphone your way, she said. Real power is deciding what you'll say once you have it, and whether your tone lifts others or flattens them. The assembled journalists glanced at one another, hesitant to shout the usual barrage of questions. Her aura had rewritten the tempo. Nobody wanted to interrupt something that felt this final. Ruth closed the folder under her arm, then added with gentle clarity, I don't have the last word on justice.
None of us do.
But we can decide that our next word, our collective one, is kinder, wiser, more curious than the last.
A hush followed, deep and peaceful.
It was not the silence of tension now, but of recognition. Even the city seemed to exhale. Car horns softened, conversations resumed with lowered pitch. The world felt, for a fleeting instant, civil again. She turned to leave, her steps unhurried, shoes tapping faint echoes against the marble. One journalist finally called out, voice trembling, Judge Ruth, do you think you've changed anything? She looked back over her shoulder, smile bending into something humble but sure. Change is already happening. It begins the moment we listen without the intention to win.
Then she was gone, swallowed by the light.
Cameras kept rolling, but there was nothing left to capture except the resonance she'd set in motion, an invisible shift in tone that would ripple through dinner tables, classrooms, and comment sections for weeks. Somewhere, a teacher paused a replay of her speech and asked a room full of students, "So, what kind of voice will you choose to be?" And as the echoes of that exchange fade, one question lingers: what kind of voice will each of us choose to be? The frame freezes once more on that moment, the hush, the stare, the silence that spoke louder than insults ever could. Under the same lights where tempers once flared, calm had proven itself revolutionary. The narrator's voice returns, lower now, the cadence of reflection rather than report. You've just witnessed what happens when conviction minds its tone, when power pauses long enough to remember purpose. What began as confrontation ended as composition, a living demonstration that composure is not retreat but resistance of a nobler kind. Images flicker across the screen: Ruth walking away beneath golden light, Jasmine watching with renewed respect, millions of viewers replaying the scene not for drama but for direction. The music swells, strings carrying the subtle heartbeat of hope. The narrator continues: in every debate that turns sour, in every online argument gasping for empathy, we hold the same choice. We can shout to win, or we can breathe to heal.
Calm is courage.
Dignity is strength disguised as grace. And sometimes the most radical act in a divided world is to stay human in the heat. The words linger against shots of ordinary faces, students, parents, workers, each reflecting the calm they wish to see echoed back. If you felt that moment stir something in you, the voice invites: don't let it stop here.
Share it forward.
Speak gently where others shout. Comment not to cancel, but to connect. Be the tone that refuses toxicity. Because one act of restraint, repeated a million times, becomes a language that no outrage can drown. The camera lifts upward, city skyline glowing beneath a slow-rising sun. This isn't the end of an argument, this is the beginning of a better one. Fade to black. Music sustains, carrying hope instead of hostility.